Hello there. Having looked at the McDowell's signature whisky and finding that quite a few of you were interested by that, I thought I'd take a look at another Indian produced whisky. This is Antiquity Blue, which refers to itself as an Ultra Premium Whisky, and it was first launched back in 1992. At that stage produced by a company called Shaw Wallace. And what it is a blend of Indian whiskies and Scotch whiskies, which is a category that's seen immense growth over the last 30 years or so. So as a blend, this appears to be combining both Scottish grain and malt whiskies with Indian aged malt and grain whisky. And in their publicity, the company stresses their strong connections with the distillery at Cameronbridge, where Diageo, the multinational spirits giant, produce their grain whisky for Scotland. But as I've said, I've also seen reference to the use of Indian grain whisky. So it seems from what I've read that both malts and grains for the blend are sourced from both locations. Now the whisky, as you can see, is bottled in a distinctly blue bottle to make it stand out on retail shelves. And the Antiquity brand has two expressions. There's this Antiquity Blue, then there's also a whisky called Antiquity Rare, although from what I can see, it doesn't seem that the pricing of the two is significantly different. Although there are notes to say that the Rare expression was released to capitalise on the initial success and popularity of the Antiquity Blue. Now today, Shaw Wallace whisky brands are owned by United Spirits Limited, and USL, as they're known, are a subsidiary of United Breweries Group, UB Group, led by Vijay Mulliya, who's also had a hand in the production of the McDowell's signature whisky, which I've already looked at. And United Breweries Group acquired a 54.54% stake in Shaw Wallace back in 2005, before they gained full control and merged their operations in 2008. And all these companies are now part of Diageo's portfolio of Indian spirits. Now this brand has seen periods of absolutely spectacular growth. In the late 1990s, at one stage Antiquity reached a high point where it controlled 44% of India's premium whisky segment. And between 1997 and 1998, this brand saw 50% growth in its sales. The brand is now exported as far afield as China, New Zealand, Australia, the United States of America. And I think it's fair to say that within the Indian whisky sector, there is this whole promotional mechanic of offering the whiskies in these 180 milliliter sized bottles for customers who may not be so familiar with drinking whisky to sample the product. One thing I saw that did amuse me was the fact that in 2008, Antiquity underwent a rebranding. Working with a London-based company, Classons International, evidently they revamped the brand's packaging to emphasise its heritage. I found the idea of a brand that at that stage was only 16 years old trying to emphasise its heritage just a little amusing. The heritage that they were talking about, evidently, dates back to 1826. And Scotsman Robert Stein, evidently an ancestor of the UK's former Prime Minister David Cameron, pioneered the production of grain whisky using a continuous still rather than a pot still at a distillery in Cameronbridge. And today, Diageo, its owners, stress the fact that Antiquity Blue includes what they refer to as the finest grain whisky from Scotland, produced at this same Cameronbridge distillery and using a process derived from the stills that Stein had developed, although actually I believe the stills they use these days are coffee stills, so a development of Stein's original process. Now, while in places the promotional literature gets a little confused, they do actually try and stress the fact that the malt whiskies that go into this are produced in copper pot stills. Now, as far as I know, that's a legal requirement for a malt whisky produced in Scotland, but I don't know enough to know whether that might be something exceptional and special if you're talking about Indian malt whisky. Now, the blend is actually put together and overseen by somebody called Craig Wallace, who is Diageo's Scotland-based master blender. There is very little detail about how this blend is put together. What they do say is that the components of Antiquity, those imported Scottish malts, Scottish grains and Indian whisky, presumably malt and grain, are matured and mellowed separately in American white oak casks. This is done to mellow them and develop their flavour profile before being blended. Now, while some blended whiskies are actually then returned to cask to marry prior to being bottled, evidently that's not the case with Antiquity. I think the idea is that the previous maturing in white oak of all the components gives them similarities that gives them a greater ability to marry at the point of blending. There's a note about the elements being fused with premium Scotch. As there's no blending information given, we don't know the proportions between malt whiskies and grain whiskies, the proportion between Scottish whiskies and Indian whiskies. There's no age statement given, so we don't know how long any or all of the components have aged in white oak. Now, I did wonder if it might be possible to narrow down the likely Scottish malt whisky components of this by looking at Diageo's portfolio of distilleries. But when I did, I note that Diageo owned 21 different distilleries, and these are in the Highlands, in Speyside, the Islands, and on Islay. So really, the composition of the whisky is a bit of a mystery to us. So there's only one way to find out more, and that's to nose and to taste it. So looking here at the whisky before I've diluted it on this occasion, marketing literature refers to this as having the character of antique gold. Now, that might be quite a romantic description, but I think it's fairly accurate. It's a pale gold colour here. I'm swirling it in my glass here, and the whisky is bottled at 42.8%. So unsurprisingly, it's forming some very noticeable tears on the glass. I'll take a nose of the neat spirit, and then perhaps I'll add a little bit of water to it as well. So here we go. The initial aromas are quite rich and sweet. There's almost a dried fruit, a sultana note. There are caramel notes. Overlaying that, there are some rich, sweet spices, almost ginger, vanilla, cedary notes. The white oak character is clearly there, although it does seem to be quite well married to the fruit. It's not standing out particularly on its own. There are one or two other hints towards the end of the nose that I'd like to see if they develop further once I dilute the whisky slightly. It seems as if there are some delicate heathery touches, perhaps even hints of peat and iodine that might suggest that there are some Islay whiskies in here as well. So I'll just put a tiny drop of water in here just to see if it can open up the aromas a little. Diluting the whisky appears to have softened its richness. There's less of a sort of a caramel core than perhaps there was. And if anything, some heathery notes become more obvious. So let's have a taste. As a whisky, the style seems to be quite elegant. The front palate has a mellowness and a smoothness, with ripe hints, sultanas, caramel, again, hints of sweet spice. Following on from those, the whisky becomes a little spirity, and some slightly drying, vanilla-y, cedary oak starts to take over in the mid-palate. The finish again becomes mellow and rich and is lasting quite nicely. Again, giving me those notes of dried fruit, caramel, delicate notes of ginger and some quite enduring notes of orange peel. In the midst of all that, there may be a little bit of the delicate heatheriness that was more apparent on the palate. And while there may be some hints of peatiness on the finish, they're very well integrated with everything else and they're not standing out as pungent flavours. In general, I find this quite a palatable whisky. It's smooth and it's rounded, but it's not particularly challenging in terms of pungent aromas of iodine, peat. Even the whisky's heatheriness is quite restrained. The elements work harmoniously together, both on the attack and the finish. I wasn't quite so sure about the mid-palate, but yes, perhaps the point is that this is quite an approachable, versatile, quality blended whisky, probably quite a good entry point to the sector for people who don't drink a lot of whisky and might find some of the more pungent expressions of it more difficult to deal with. I guess the relatively light and elegant style would also suit the whisky for mixing if you chose to use the spirit in that way. Looking at the WineSearcher aggregated critic score, this was given 89 out of 100, and I note also that it's won some medals in international competitions, such as the highly respected International Wine and Spirit Competition. So yes, unsurprisingly, given the resources available to the producers from Diageo's portfolio of distilleries, I think this is a completely acceptable gateway. It may not offer enough challenge for experienced malt whisky drinkers. I'm somewhat amused by the attempt to try and give a 200-year history to a product that was first created in 1992. But I guess they were probably looking for some sort of justification to use the brand name Antiquity for the whisky. Personally, I wouldn't let the contrived backstory worry you too much, but I would appreciate it if the producers were a little more transparent about exactly how the whisky is put together. They don't need to give us the whole recipe, but some of their promotional information is confusing, some of the information they give is slightly conflicting. And I think that somehow undermines some of the authenticity they're seeking for their brand. So thank you so much for joining me. I do hope you've enjoyed the tasting. If you have, it would be fantastic if you'd press the like button. I'd really appreciate that. If you have any comments or questions, do please pop those in the comments box below. I'd love to know what you think about the tastings I'm doing, the products I'm looking at, or anything else that relates to that. If you have any friends you think might like to watch the video, do please feel free to pass it on to them. I'd really appreciate your endorsement in that way. And if you're watching these videos and you haven't already subscribed, it would really help me to develop the channel further if you'd consider doing that. I will leave a link in the box below to the webpage on the WhineSearcher website for this whisky so that you can see if it's available in a market near you and at what price. And if you're interested in trying it, as I say, like many of these whiskies that are blended in India, it's available in handy sampling size bottles. So thank you for taking the time to watch this video. And I do hope that maybe you'll manage to make some time in the near future to come and watch some more tasting videos. So until I see you then, bye for now.